Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. Diep knelt in the rice field, her hands raw with mud, scooping seedlings under the dawn's faint light. Hockey barked nearby, his warmth a quiet balm, but her heart trembled, wondering if she'd ever be enough for James. The phone in her pocket, his gift, weighed heavy. A promise of learning she feared she couldn't keep. The air carried the cluck of chickens, the scent of wet earth sharp, but her mind clung to James's voice, tight with worry from their call last night. His company was cracking, a storm she couldn't grasp, and she worked harder, her shovel biting the soil. Each seedling a vow to build a life with him. Her sandals sank into the mud, each step a thread to a past that clung like damp earth. She'd come to this village broken, a girl of 5, her parents' dust, her uncle's coins heavy with betrayal. He'd sold her, his voice sharp, and she'd lived with strangers, her name her only shield, until she'd fled at 12, her heart a drumbeat against fear. She'd built a shack, a garden, a love with James, but her past pulsed when she touched the phone, its buttons a puzzle, its screen a world she didn't know. School had ended at 9, her 3rd grade letters faded, her dreams buried under rice and want. James had found her, his truck mired in mud, her laughter shy as she pushed. "You're enough," he'd said, his eyes warm as the soil, but today, her hands raw, she doubted, her fear a whisper that she'd fail him. The field stretched wide, their earth soft and dark, the scent of buffalo thick in the air. Diep worked, her back bent, her heart racing, knowing each coin from this labor was a step toward James, toward a future she ached to touch. The sun climbed, its heat heavy on her shoulders, and she thought of the phone, of James teaching her its buttons, his voice patient, his faith a vow. Hockey scampered through the mud, his bark sharp, and she smiled, her heart heavy, knowing her work, her effort, was all she had for a man whose world was vast. She'd married once at 16 to a man who saw her as less, his hands heavy, his voice sharp. She'd fled, her name her map, and built this life, hockey's warmth her constant, but the phone, its promise of learning, was a mirror to her lack, and she trembled, her love for James a spark she wouldn't let die. She moved to the grapefruit hills, their air thick with citrus, and helped the workers, their bags 30 pounds each, a weight she carried with care. 20 tons, a farmer said, and she nodded, her arms straining, her heart steady, knowing each bag was for James, for hockey, for a dream that grew. She gave water to the workers, their faces lined with sweat, and candy to children, their laughter a light against her doubt. The hills hummed, the stream nearby glittering under the noon sun, and she knelt by its bank, her fingers trailing in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. She'd stood here with James, his hand warm, his voice a vow. "We'll build a farm," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart wide as the hills, her fear a shadow she'd pushed away. But his voice last night, tight with worry, had cracked her calm, and she wondered, her basket heavy with water, if she could ever be enough for his world of wealth and secrets. At the market, its stalls alive with Tet's hum, she met Min, a stranger with a guitar, his fingers worn but sure. "Sing," she said, her voice soft, and he nodded, his song a blade to her heart. A small girl in the middle of a green field, fatherless and motherless. Every wind blows through the thatched roof. The words cut deep, and she wept, her hands trembling, her basket heavy with water she'd meant to give. "It's my life," she said, her voice breaking, and Min nodded, his eyes soft, his voice a vow. "Keep shining," he said, and she smiled, her tears falling, her kindness a bridge to a stranger who saw her pain. She gave him water, its weight light but warm, and they talked, their voices low, of passion, of work. "Why not business?" she asked, thinking of James, of wealth she couldn't touch. "Music's my life," Min said, and she nodded, her heart racing, knowing her dream to learn to stand by James was a fire she'd keep. Min sat by the market, his guitar a shield, his voice low as he faced Hung, his brother, whose eyes were sharp with worry. "Go home," Hung said. "The company needs you." Min shook his head, his heart torn, his mind set on music. "I live for this," he said, and Hung sighed, his voice heavy with duty. "Mother's sick," he said, and Min faltered, his fingers still on the strings, his heart a drumbeat against fear. "I'll come," he said, and Hung nodded, his boots heavy on the earth, his love a vow that held them still. Min thought of Diep, of her tears, of a song that carried her pain, and smiled, his heart heavy, knowing his music, his passion, was a light he couldn't let die. James sat in a cafe, its air thick with dust, his voice low as he spoke to Tongue. A friend whose eyes were sharp with loyalty. John's pulling capital, twin son, every shareholder, he said, his jaw tight, his heart racing. Tongue knotted, his voice steady, speaking of John's shadow, of a plan that felt like a trap. He's targeting us, James said, and the words hung, a shadow that lingered, a mystery he couldn't unravel. He thought of his father, of the empire they'd built, and vowed to keep it secret, to shield him from the storm. Text him, James said. Agree to his terms, draw him out. Tongue knotted, his faith a vow, but doubt pressed on James's heart, a fear that his world and Diep's place in it could crumble. Duke stood by a warehouse, his voice low, his eyes sharp with hate. James's father took everything, he said, and his colleague listened, his face tight, as Duke spoke of land stolen, of a childhood lost. John's with me, he said, and this withdrawal, it's just the start. The air hummed, its weight heavy with vengeance, and Duke smiled, his heart cold, his mind set on ruin. No cause and effect, he said, only justice. And the words hung, a shadow that lingered, a plan that felt like a storm. He paid a worker $10 for eggs and walked away, his boots heavy, his hate a vow that held him still. The shack glowed, its roof patched, its yard alive with the cluck of chickens and Hockey's scamper. Diep knelt by their coop, her hands steady scattering feed, their warmth a quiet balm. She'd called James, her voice soft, her heart racing, and listened, her fear raw but easing as he spoke of work, of time he'd find. I'm busy, he'd said, his voice tight, and she'd nodded, her tears falling, her heart lifting, his faith a bridge to a future she couldn't see. You're enough, he'd said, and she clung to it, her love a vow that held her still. She thought of the phone, of its buttons she fumbled, of the learning she'd promised, and smiled, her heart heavy, knowing her work, her kindness was all she had. James met John, his boots heavy on the cafe's floor, his eyes sharp with questions. What do you want? He said, and John smiled, his voice cold, his words a blade. Your family pays, he said. Ask your father. The air hummed, its weight heavy with hate, and James sat, his water, cold and sharp, a weight in his hand. What did he do? He asked, and John laughed, his eyes dark, his voice a vow. This is just the start, he said, and James nodded, his heart racing, his mind torn between fear and resolve. He thought of Diep, of her voice, soft on the phone, and smiled, his heart steady, his love a vow that held him still. The village hummed, its rhythm a gentle pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into dusk, the stream's murmur a constant hymn. Diep wandered to the shack, her basket empty, her heart full but fragile. She fed Hockey, his warmth a quiet balm, and thought of Min, of his song, of the water she'd given. She'd worked the fields, her hands raw, her heart racing, knowing each seedling, each bag of grapefruit, was a step toward James, toward a life she wanted to build. James sat in his office, his mind torn between John's shadow and Diep's light, and vowed to fight, to hold his world, to keep her safe. Duke planned, his heart cold, his mind set on ruin, and Min walked away, his guitar a shield, his heart torn between passion and duty. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. Diep thought of James, his voice, his hands on her arm, his love a balm to her wound. He'd spoken of a farm, of fields heavy with grain, of a life they'd build, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her past lingered, a chain that whispered she wasn't enough, and John's shadow, Duke's hate, were clouds over James's world. The phone in her hand, the song in her heart, were steps toward a future she couldn't see. And the love she gave, to James, to Hockey, to strangers with heavy bags, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the fields, the song Min had sung, the water she'd given, the love that held them close. James had called, his voice a quiet strength, and she'd smiled, her heart racing, her hands still from scattering feed. You're enough, he'd said, and she'd nodded, her fear raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The chickens clucked, their feathers bright in the dusk, and she smiled, her dream of a farm, a life with James, a spark that warmed her shack. James would come, his love a vow that held her still, but Duke's hate, John's shadow, were storms she couldn't name. The games of Tet were near, their cheers a hum she'd hear, and she thought of the market, its voices loud with hope. James had listened, his eyes soft with pride, and she'd smiled, her heart heavy with doubt. Enough for him, for his world? She'd fed the chickens, tended Hockey, and thought of the song, the phone, her labor in the fields. James had stayed, his voice low with plans. We'll build, he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. Her past was a wound, but his faith was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could endure the storm. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would she rise or falter under her past? Would James unravel John's mystery, or lose his world to Duke's hate? Would Min choose his song, or the duty that called him home? Would their love, their farm stand strong, or would doubt hers, his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the chickens, the field she'd worked, the love that held her heart close, and James's voice, "You're enough," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their dream endure, a seed in Tet's glow, or wither under storms too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, Diep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of Min's song, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.